So next year,
heading home? Okay. Mind if I catch a ride? Mind if I catch a ride? Oh, that's right. I know. Well,
After cardio, you don't have to say you were talking about
Okay. And you should be off to the races. Okay.
I guess I was like, I to like another then like to take like PhD. Yes, it has a five. Yeah, okay, good.
John has been very helpful. Hey, how are you? Good to see you. Welcome. Yes.
Decisions you make, everyone.
Well, I don't make everyone happy all the time, but I've learned. I can't get out of it because you have to find your own place. Yes. Well, so that I have language that I use like sometimes in the fall. Disability, you know what I mean? And basically I said, no father like to use that language once. Sounds like my kid.
Yes, whenever you're ready, it's 1 for it now.
So, thanks everybody for coming. I'm Tom Kane. I'm a faculty director of the Center for Education Policy Research and the Partners in Education Research program. It's nice to be back in person doing the PIER public seminar. Let me see if there's Rachel had written for me a very delicate way to say it. So let me just say, where despite some uncertainty in our funding environment, we're relaunching this year. And this is the first of our sessions this year, and we get to start off with Sean. I just wanted to remind people that this session is being recorded. So please keep that in mind when you're asking questions and making comments. We do try to operate on what's called econ style, which means if you have a question in the moment, to raise your hand. If I feel like we're getting off track or we're getting bogged down, I may just say, okay, guys, let's let Sean keep going. But those are the rules. You can, if you also just want to wait till the end, we hope to save enough time at the end for a broader discussion. So now for Sean. Sean is the professor of poverty and inequality in education and professor by courtesy of sociology at Stanford's Graduate School of Education. His research focuses on causes, patterns, trends, and consequences of social and educational inequality. He's the developer of the Stanford Education Data Archive, which is based on 430 plus million standardized test scores, hopefully a few more million in the coming months, and provides measures of educational opportunity, average test score performance, achievement gaps, and other information for every public school district in the country. One thing that is worth noting is that Sean received his doctorate here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education in 1996. Okay, so thank you, Sean, for joining us and kicking off our 2025-26 PIER seminar.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you all for being here. It's always nice to come back to Harvard, especially to come back to the ed school. I have a lot of fond memories of a lot of time spent here, so it's nice to be back. I'm going to talk today about work I've been doing with two of my PhD students, Sadie Richardson and Sophia Wilson, who are pretty fabulous, I got to say, and you should look for them in their work in the coming years. They're doing great stuff. We've been trying to figure out in this project, trying to understand what's been happening to gender disparities in educational outcomes. And this was sort of prompted in some ways by the finding that sort of became evident in the last few rounds of NAEP, which showed that girls had started to fall substantially behind boys, particularly in math, after being at relative parity for a while. So these are the NAEP trends in math, reading, and in 8th grade science from 2003 onward. And you can see, for example, in 4th grade math, the blue is the boys trend line. Boys' scores fell during the pandemic, but by about half as much as girls' scores fell during the pandemic. In 4th grade math, girls fell behind much further in 8th grade math. They fell behind further in reading and behind in science, though not quite as much as in math. So if we sort of look at each of those you see this sort of consistent pattern of everyone, didn't do well during the pandemic, but girls seem to have fallen behind substantially more. If this is the same data, but now I'm just showing the gaps between boys and girls. And so you can see in fourth grade, it looks like the gap's starting to widen even before the pandemic. But in the other grades and subjects, the change really happens at the start of the pandemic, which suggests there's something, not just a kind of possible secular trend, but something specific about the pandemic that may have shaped these patterns. And so that's sort of what we set out to try to understand. Why is that happening? What's going on? I also thought, well, let's see if it's happening elsewhere, just to kind of see is the US truly exceptional, as we believe, or is it pretty much average? So the blue lines here are the NAEP scores, the gap trends I showed you before. This is fourth grade math, fourth grade reading, fourth grade science. We don't have a post-COVID science fourth grade in NAEP. And then the red lines here are the TIMSS OECD average. So this is the average of all the OECD countries in TIMSS. And you can see exactly the same trend happens in fourth grade math in TIMSS. Not much happening in reading in TIMSS, in the PEARLS data, the small decline in the US data. And then we don't have a post-COVID decline in the US, but there's a little bit of a widening of the gap in science in the OECD countries. In eighth grade, same thing, eighth grade math scores drop sharply, or the gap widened sharply, I should say, in favor of boys. Every slide I show you, if the gap is more negative, that means more in favor of boys, and if it's more positive, more in favor of girls. So it's female scores minus male scores always. So just like it's hard to know what's up. Up and down doesn't mean good or bad. It's just, but I'm going to use the convention that down is always boy favoring, up is always girl favoring. So you can see that in the OECD countries in TIMSS or in the PISA data and in the NAEP data, the eighth grade math gap widens in favor of boys during the pandemic. We see it in reading and we see it in science. So the US seems to not be an outlier in this. That is, on average, the gender gaps widened or moved in favor of boys in pretty much all the subjects in the OECD countries at roughly a similar magnitude as they did in the US. So that says there's something not exceptional about what's happening in the US about this perhaps, but something maybe that's more general. This international data, I should say, comes from a work we're doing with Kate and Chmielewski at University of Toronto, where we're going to try to explore some of the international patterns more. But for now, I'm just going to focus on the US, but I just want to sort of show that it's a fairly general pattern, at least in developed countries around the world. All right, so why did this happen? And we've sort of been looking around at the literature and trying to understand what kind of hypotheses people are suggesting that might lead to this. And so here's some, and I'm sure you can think of others, and we'd love to hear them. So one is that girls were expected to take on more caregiving roles during the pandemic. Younger kids are at home, they can't go to childcare, and so if girls might be more expected to take on a kind of caregiving role, that means they have less time to spend on school, and therefore their scores go down more than boys. There's some international data showing that girls generally in lots of countries reported doing more caregiving during the pandemic than boys did. It's unclear to me how much that might affect elementary school kids. Our data is going to be 3rd through 8th grade data, and the NAEP data that I showed you is 4th and 8th grade. So it's unclear if you might expect high school students to be expected to do a lot more caregiving than you might, elementary and middle school. So unclear if that's the reason. During the pandemic, adults reported more endorsement of traditional gender roles during the pandemic, and so you might think maybe there is a kind of a reversion to more traditional stereotypical gender roles, expectations on the part of parents that might have fed into more of the caregiving kind of story, but might have also given girls a kind of message that maybe math wasn't as important or something like this. You can imagine lots of ways in which kind of a kind of reemergence of, or a stronger kind of traditional gender norms might have disadvantaged girls' engagement in schooling. Another possibility is that girls were just differently sensitive or aware to things that were going on in the pandemic. People were sick, people were dying, family members were unemployed. And so if girls are sort of more attuned to that or more affected by that, then that may have impacted their ability to focus on school. And there's some data showing that depression and anxiety and feelings of hopelessness were reported more for girls during the pandemic than for boys, and rose from prior levels more for girls than for boys. And so you could certainly see how that might affect it. There may have been differential effects of the lack of social interaction, to the extent that girls may have depended more on social interaction or gotten kind of more of their support system from social interaction than boys. Then the kind of shutdown of the pandemic might have affected girls more than boys. And then it's also maybe girls benefit more from schooling than boys. This is a hypothesis you hear a lot of people talking about these days to sort of explain kind of why boys in general do worse in school than girls. And so if girls benefit more from school, then they may suffer more from being out of school during the pandemic. There is some data that girls reported liking remote schooling less than boys did. And there's a study of female and male college students showing that female college students performed worse on exams when their classes were remote during the pandemic, and boys or males' scores weren't affected by whether they were remote or not. And girls reported liking online classes less well than boys. So there may be some sort of engagement with school or benefit to schooling that was lost for girls, and that wasn't lost so much for boys.
So, Sean, I was just wondering, might some of this have nothing to do with the pandemic? Like if, at least in the graph you showed for the OECD, there was a decline had started clearly before the pandemic. That might be other things?
Yeah, so if you look at fourth grade math, it certainly looks in the US and the OECD countries like the shift towards more male favoring gaps started before the pandemic, but that's not true in any of the other grades and subjects. You can sort of see in all of these, depending how you read the reading one, maybe the PISA ones have been going down for a while. But not in the US and in most of these other ones, it really starts pretty clearly at the timing of the pandemic. So there seems to be at least something happening that's pandemic related. I certainly think that the broader trend in NAEP scores is not only pandemic related. There's clearly a longer secular trend that started 4 to 6 years before the pandemic of just scores generally going down. But this seems to have a pandemic specific kind of timing. I can.
Sort of looks like a cohort.
In the U.S., it does look like cohort. If you shift the 4th and 8th grade, then it kind of looks cohorty. It doesn't look like that in reading. Then the timing doesn't line up at all. So there's possible cohort effect. Andrew?
And we also look at the 9-10 splits a lot, or changes in standard deviations. You also see greater increases in inequality within reporting.
No, we haven't looked at that yet, so I don't know the answer, but it's on our list of things to look at.
Sorry if I'm anticipating anything, but have you zoomed in countries in the OECD that didn't experience school closures as much? I'm thinking about Sweden.
Yeah, so in the project I'm doing with Kate and Chmielewski, that's what we'll be doing, is sort of looking at different countries that had sort of different experiences of the pandemic. We haven't done any of that yet, but I'm going to do that with 7,000 school districts in the US. So we're going to sort of see where the variation comes from to some extent. But we haven't done it yet cross-nationally. Susanna?
Seen also there are differential changes in the absenteeism, and that affects.
Yeah, so far we don't have absenteeism data by gender. but it's on our list to try to figure out if we can get it at least for some subset of states. And I talked to Dan about it earlier. Yeah?
How should we be thinking about the reading scores? Because by looking at this, it seems like post-pandemic, the men are like 0.2 standard deviations below women in reading, and in math, women get to being 0.2 standard deviations below men in math. And so can you talk a little bit about the reading gender gap, and is that something that we should be concerned about?
So if you look even further back in time, girls' scores on reading tests are consistently higher than boys in 4th grade, in 8th grade. And they've been pretty stable in the US at somewhere around 0.2, 0.25 standard deviations for a long time. There's a little bit of a dip in the pandemic, but it's not sort of huge in magnitude compared to other changes. There's a little bit more of a dip in the reading gap in 8th grade. But this pattern is, you see it almost everywhere. When we look district by district, there's almost, maybe there is no district in the country where boys outperform girls in reading. Basically everywhere, girls perform better than boys. That's not true in math. There's some where it's different, but in reading, it's just a very consistent pattern, which isn't my goal to understand why that's happening today. We're really interested in the changes, but.
Okay, so we should just take, like, in a sense, like there's some gross differences in levels that have been pretty persistent over time, and the real action is getting the changes. The other related question too is like, how important are the reading skills for math? Because like one of the things that's striking to me is that despite the fact that boys are doing relatively poorly in reading, they're still like overperforming in the math. And so like in some senses that I'm like underestimating some of the gender gaps in the math performance.
Yeah, I think that's possible. I'll talk a little bit about an adjustment we make for the fact that some tests have a lot more constructed response items on them than others. It turns out, we published a paper on this about 7, 8 years ago. It turns out that on tests where there's more constructed response items, girls perform better than boys do relative to the same set of students taking a test at the same time that doesn't have constructed response items. And so we make an adjustment to kind of correct for the amount of constructed response items on the test in order to adjust for that. But that would suggest, as you say, that some of the math gap is underestimated. That is, because girls are sort of likely to be performing better in part because of the better reading skills. I don't know how much because we haven't really done that kind of analysis. Yeah.
So let's let Sean, invoking my authority.
But Tom, I wanted to ask if anyone has questions about my title slide. All right. No.
Sorry, I got it started.
That's fine. All right. So we're thinking about kind of what might be causing it, and we've got these various sort of vague hypotheses that there's some cases some sort of suggestive evidence of and whatnot. And spoiler, I'm not going to be able to tell you, yes, this one is totally it and that one's totally not, but we're going to have, I think, some interesting evidence that speaks to these. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to look how the change in the gender gap during the pandemic is associated with local conditions. And we're going to do that by looking at 7,000 different school districts across the country where we can measure the change in the gender gap, and we can measure a variety of characteristics of the district during the pandemic. We don't have micro level data, so we can't say this is what this particular child experienced. Her uncle got sick and her dad lost his job and so on, but we can say in this community, this was what the death rate was, this is what the unemployment rate was, and so on like that. So we're operating at a kind of community level rather than an individual level. So we're going to leverage this kind of variation across communities in the ways the pandemic affected people's lives. All right, so the data we're going to use is the CETA data, which Tom mentioned. So the CETA data is standardized state test scores. So every state administers standardized tests to 3rd through 8th graders every year in math and reading. We use all those data from 2009 to 2024. and we link them to a common scale via NAEP. So one of the problems, of course, is that every state's tests aren't comparable to each other in terms of their scales or what counts as proficient, and they change over time, and they're different across grades, and so it's a giant spaghetti pile of incomparable data. And so we use NAEP. Thank you, NAEP. Thank you, Marty. Powered by NAEP. We use NAEP. We use NAEP to link the test state assessments together to put them all on a common scale. And I'm not going to talk in detail about how we do that now. I'm happy to answer questions about it later. But that means we can compare the test scores in every single school district across all 50 states, across all 15 years of span of our data, and so on. So that gives us an enormous amount of power to look at variation across places. And here we're going to use the data disaggregated by gender. We also have them available by race and economic disadvantage. The data are all publicly available on our website. You can get them and play with them to your heart's content. And we built the data through my team at the Educational Opportunity Project, and then the later years in conjunction with Tom and our Education Recovery Scorecard. So the data include about 13,000 school districts, 70,000 public schools, basically every public school and district in the country that has 3rd through 8th graders. I think, Tom, you were looking at an old press release or something, because now it's about 500 million standardized test scores. So it's a lot of information. So the data I'm going to use in the analytics sample today is going to be limited to data from 41 states for which we have post-pandemic data. There's a few states that don't release sufficient data online, and a few states that have high levels of non-participation in their tests and so on. And so we're going to use 41 states, and we're going to use data from about 7,000 school districts. It's not going to include charter schools, which is partly a result of the way states report their data. They often, because they'll suppress the data for small entities, and so if a school isn't part of a district, its data gets suppressed and the administrative part of the district doesn't, and we can't stitch them together and make a whole out of it. And so for here, we're looking at administrative districts for which we have post-2019 data and some pre-2019 data. So for each district, we might have up to 336 observations, so 14 years, 6 grades, 2 subjects, 2 genders. On average, we have about 240 observations per district. The reason there's some missing data is because in some years, we don't have the data from the state. In some years, the samples are too small to get reliable estimates. In some grades, sometimes in 8th grade, a state will give different math tests to different kids, and so we can't make them comparable. So there's sort of a hodgepodge of reasons why we don't have the complete data. But we have a lot of it. We have about 1.6 million observations. Each observation is based on roughly 200 students' test scores, so it's about 320 million test scores that sit under this analysis. So, you know, the old joke, if the couple comes out of the restaurant and the wife says, man, that food was terrible. And the guy says, yeah, but at least there was a lot of it. And so that's, you know, our data's not perfect, but there's a lot of it, right? All right, so the one thing I alluded to before about constructing the gender gaps is that girls perform better on tests with constructed response items than boys do. And states vary enormously in how many items on their assessments are constructed response. When we did this study using data from 2008, 2009, some states had 0% constructed response and some had 60% of the items on the test were constructed response. So that means you could get very different gaps depending on whether you were in a state with no or with 60% of the items constructed response. And so the way we adjust for this, and this is what we've done in other work on gender, is we residualize the gap. So we use the NAEP to tell us what the gap is in, say, 4th grade in 2017. And then we use the state data to tell us what the gap is in the district but we subtract off the average gap in the state on the state test. So we're sort of using the state test to say how much bigger or smaller is the gap in this district than it is in the state as a whole. And then we're going to add that residual state level gap based on the state assessment to the NAEP state gap. And so now we're sort of stitching together NAEP, powered by NAEP, thank you. We're stitching together NAEP and the state test in a way that corrects for any variation across states in constructed response items or other things that might lead to sort of differential performance by gender that's sort of orthogonal to what we're trying to measure. It's not perfect, but it sort of gets us closer to what we want. All right, so now we get some statistical models. So we have this pile of data, like we need to actually produce some parameter estimates that we want from it. And so here's what we're going to do. For each district year, we're going to have 6 observations through 8th grade in a given subject. And we're going to just fit a linear model through that and take the midpoint of that line and call that the average test score in that district in grade 5.5. The reason is sometimes we're missing a few grades here and there, and so we don't want to just average the 6 grades, but I also don't want to fit the model over and over to every grade of data, right? So we're going to first get this estimate alpha YD, which is going to be the average test score in district D in year Y. And then we're going to model within a district, we're going to say that the average score or the average gap in that district in a year is a function of some time variables. And I'm going to parameterize it in this super confusing way to see if you're awake. I'll explain why, but basically we're going to have a year term that's just centered at 2019. So 2019 is our intercept. We're going to have a quadratic term that's unnecessarily complicated. And then we're going to have a dummy variable for whether it's post-22, and then we're going to have a time variable that starts at 22 and goes forward to sort of have a different trend after 2022. The reason for this super complicated thing is because we want to be able to interpret the parameters this way. So that there's an intercept, which tells us the average score in 2019 in that district. There's a linear term that tells us the average linear rate of change from 2009 to 19, so that's the kind of pre-pandemic linear trend. There's this, which is beta 2, which is the curvature of that trend. So we're going to let the kind of districts have nonlinear trends prior to 2019. And then beta 3 is going to tell us the difference between the counterfactual value of the gap we would estimate if we let the trend continue linearly from 2019 onward. It's the difference between that and then what we observe. And so that's the parameter we're interested in. That's the kind of deviation from expected value. And then beta 4 is this sort of post-pandemic kind of trend term, which I'm not going to focus on today. To make it clear, here's the gender gap in the average district in our sample in reading and math. You can see in reading, it's pretty flat, slight upward curvature, and then it drops. But how big is the parameter we want? Well, what we're doing is we're saying, suppose this continued linearly past here. The reason for that complicated quadratic term is that it lets the counterfactual be a linear extrapolation of the prior trend rather than a quadratic extrapolation, which I sort of don't think is very plausible, introduces a lot of wild things. So we've tried some alternate specifications and the results aren't very sensitive to it. But so what we're doing is we're saying that's what we think the counterfactual would be. And then this difference between the counterfactual and the actual value in 2022, that's the beta 3 term. That's what we're going to say is the effect of the pandemic or the kind of pandemic related change in the gender gap in a specific district. You can see in math, the curvature was downward, and so gender gaps were already trending more in favor of boys. And so even though the gap widened a fair bit in favor of boys, our counterfactual is also a lot lower than 2019. So this model says the sort of pandemic effect on the gender gap was smaller in math than it was in reading because we're sort of extrapolating this forward. Does that make sense?
So, Sean, like if student achievement is following like a random walk at the district level, that adding in the trends might, add, some noise into it. Like, would any of the results you'll show us be different? Probably check.
If we just do a straight drop with just
since 2019.
Yeah, we've done it, and it's very similar to what we get. And we've also done it where we just throw away the early data and we just fit a linear trend and just try to use the recent data for a linear trend, and it's also quite similar. So it's not super sensitive to that. There's, some differences, but I don't think I have a table showing all the sensitivity checks, but the idea here is we don't obviously we didn't randomize pandemics so that we have like a pandemic happen in some places and didn't in other places, totally randomly. So the best way we can get a kind of counterfactual for what would have happened in a district is some kind of extrapolation. I don't want to claim this is like the cleanest identification strategy in the world, but I want to be clear what parameter it is we're estimating for each district, and then that's what we're going to try to understand. Why was it bigger in some districts than other districts? And hopefully that tells us something about what were the features of the pandemic that were sort of led to this much bigger decline in scores for girls than for boys. Yeah.
Do you have a sense of why, going back to the mechanisms you were citing, why the drop would be more precipitous in reading than math? Is there kind of a different set of mechanisms that operate? Was there a uniform kind of version of learning that would apply for each of these?
I don't. I'd be open to hearing one if anyone has one. Yeah. Catherine, if you have one, let me know. But yeah, I don't. I mean, partly the bigger gap is driven by extrapolation. If I just took the raw difference, it's about the same size in math and reading. So I also don't want to necessarily make a huge amount out of the different magnitude because it depends on how I construct the counterfactual, and we don't have any sort of super clear way to decide what the right counterfactual is. So I just want to be clear, in everything else I'm going to show you, the parameter we're interested in is the difference between the observed gap in 2022 and the predicted counterfactual gap in 2022. And we want to know why is that bigger in some places than others. So all of that pile of data just exists so we can get that one parameter for every district. It exists for other reasons too, but that's sort of what we're using it for. And now you might ask, did the gap decline because girls' scores went down a lot or boys' scores went up? So this is the math trend by gender. So boys' scores went down, but girls' scores went down more. And if you draw a counterfactual, the counterfactual decline is bigger for girls. In reading, it's the same thing. There's actually no real difference from the counterfactual trend for boys in math. In reading, they just kind of continued on their trend of reading a lot worse than girls. But girls' reading scores fell from what you would have predicted from the counterfactual. So the reason it grew in reading is really driven entirely by a decline in girls' reading scores relative to the counterfactual. The reason it fell in math is because it declined for both, but more for girls. We also look separately by grade, and so this is the gap trend in math for 3rd and 8th grade. You can see in 8th grade, the gap is a little boy favoring in 2009, but by 2019, it's at parity, and then it drops. And the 3rd grade gap has already started going down here. And Dan, as you said, we've made figures where we shift the blue line over by 5 years, and then these things actually look like the difference is pretty equal within a cohort. So this looks like it could be a cohort effect, but it doesn't look like that when you look at reading. You shift the blue line over, the story isn't really any different. So in reading, girls' scores dropped sharply from what the counterfactual would be, but boys pretty much trended as they would have been. So a lot of the action is at 8th grade. What I'm going to show you is average effects or average patterns across 3rd through 8th grade, and we've done a bunch of analyses to see if the association of these declines with other variables depends on the grade, and it by and large doesn't. There's a few significant coefficients out of a pile of them, but it's not enough that you would want to make a lot out of it. So everything else I'm going to show you pretty much holds across grade levels. Even though the decline is larger, it's not because the effects of the things we're looking at were bigger for 8th graders than they were for 3rd graders. All right, so now remember the beta 3 was the parameter we were interested in. We had all these 5 parameters describing that time trend. And we're going to model each of them as a function of district level characteristics. And so the gamma, the vector of gamma, of coefficients on those things, gamma 3, that's the thing we're most interested in. Now this is a difference in difference in difference in difference. This is a 4-way interaction. It's a gap interacted with time, interacted with a change in the time slope, interacted with a district level covariate. I've never seen an article publish a 4-way interaction that had any significance, but we have a lot of data, so we have a lot of power to detect even this, as you'll see. So that's the model. We're going to fit it in one big giant hierarchical linear model, but I wanted to sort of show you the different pieces of how we build it. So this is formally the whole model we fit. All right, so how do we interpret these estimates? I want to sort of, there's some ways to think about what we're doing as descriptive and some ways to think about what we're doing as sort of weakly causal. And the way to think about it as descriptive is if we're trying to answer the question, how did the gender gaps change during the pandemic, and how did they change differently in different kinds of communities? Or another way to say that is how did the association between community characteristics change during the pandemic? So did the relationship between district socioeconomic status get stronger or weaker during the pandemic? It's sort of another way of saying the same thing. So we don't have any causal purchase to say what's the effect of a district characteristic, because we don't have any hope that any of those are exogenously determined, right? District characteristics, whether it's demographic characteristics or things that happened during COVID, are all tied up together. So if we're thinking about the association between a district characteristic and the patterns of gaps or the changes in gaps, then I think of this as a descriptive enterprise. But if we think of the pandemic as the treatment, right, don't think of the district characteristic as the treatment, then if you're sort of willing to extrapolate the prior trend as a counterfactual, then you have a sort of a weak identification strategy to say what's the effect of the pandemic and how did it differ across different kinds of communities. I'm not claiming this is the best causal strategy in the world, but I think there's sort of 2 different questions being asked here. One is, how are district characteristics related to pandemic effects? And that's not causal. And the other is, what effect did the pandemic have on gaps, and how did that differ across places? The differ across places is not causal, but the effect is. So anyway, I'm trying to say it's sort of in between, just partly a descriptive enterprise, and partly trying to sort of say something about what happens in a global crisis, like what are the effects of that, and just see how they vary. But really, I think the larger goal that we have in mind is to think about how do societal gender norms interact with crises. So we live in a world where there's lots of and a wide variety of kind of gender norms, expectations, behaviors, attitudes, discrimination, et cetera. And then a giant crisis comes along. And how do those 2 things interact? Does one make the other worse or better or what? So in some ways, that's really the kind of bigger project here in addition to the kind of concrete project here. You had a question there.
I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned before that you're excluding charter schools from the analysis. I wanted to ask you, how confident are we that selection into charter schools is orthogonal to the double difference of gender and COVID pre and post? So could it be that there is a differential selection?
Sean, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question here is, we're not using charter schools, and so are we worried in a sense that that might create some bias? Is the differential participation of kids in charter schools somehow biasing our estimates here? It's a four-way difference, and so it would have to be something about charter school enrollment, selectivity, selection into charter schools that changed over time in different ways in different kinds of communities that was correlated with this. So it could be. The other thing we can do, but we haven't yet, is we can just rerun the analysis on districts that have no charter schools in them and see what happens there. But we haven't done that yet.
Yeah, so there's definitely compelling hypotheses for the gender norms, but I'm wondering, is there any public health evidence about differences in boys and girls in actually contracting the virus and how that impacts their health or how quickly they recover or things like that?
That is a very good question, and I'm going to look for the answer to it, but I don't know. The question was, is there any evidence from public health about whether boys or girls had different rates of contracting the virus or seriousness of the virus or impacts of the virus that might be a sort of direct mechanism? I take it you to be implying that sort of girls are a lot sicker and that they just couldn't study or perform as well on tests. I don't know of any evidence, but we will certainly look for it because I think that's worth answering. Thanks.
Some colleagues of mine actually looked at variation across state, like death for adults between women and men, and found a lot of variations, made them speculate that it is more social and not biological. You would expect a more constant effect with biological.
That death rates have a social component.
Yeah, because you're seeing the gaps.
Yeah.
Not very a lot.
Yeah. We have local death rate data, which we're going to use here, but we don't have it broken down by gender, though I wonder if it's available by gender, which would help us not just answer your question, but actually sort of test whether it's a mechanism, I think. I know Sadie and Sophia are watching online, so let's make a note to look into that. All right, I was just going to say one other thing here, and now I've forgotten. It'll come back to me. All right, so let's look at some results. How am I on time, by the way? Let me see. Oh, good. All right. So we're just going to look here at what's the variance in the parameter we're interested in. So the mean change in the math scores is negative 0.056, so about 0.05 standard deviations. But it has a standard deviation of 0.072, so it has a pretty wide range. So from about negative 0.2 standard deviations, that's the gap shifting 0.2 standard deviations in favor of boys, to positive 0.085. So there are places where the gap shifted in favor of girls. In reading, a pretty similar pattern. The range is a little bit wider. But so the takeaway here is there's lots of variation across districts in the change in the gap during the pandemic. And I should say, this is not the standard deviation of the estimates of the change. This is the estimate of the standard deviation that comes out from the maximum likelihood estimator of the multi-level model. So this isn't inflated because of noise in any one place's estimate. All right, so now we're going to try to model that. What are the district covariates we're going to use? So we have a number of measures, and we collapsed some of them into indices to sort of lessen the dimensionality of it. After we also did a bunch of bivariate stuff to sort of see if we were sort of putting things together that didn't seem like they went together. So the first is a kind of economic and structural resources and racial composition factor. It's the first principal component of an SES measure, which is itself a composite of median family income, percent of adults with a bachelor's degree, poverty rate, SNAP eligibility rate, female-headed household rate, and unemployment rate for a school district. So we get that data from the American Community Survey. We make this SES composite. That goes into this bigger composite along with the broadband access rate. So that's the census, or the ACS gives us the proportion of households that have both access to high-speed internet and have a device in the house through which they could access that. That's near 100% in many places in the United States, but it's as low as 50 or 60% in places as well. So there's some meaningful variation there. Then we have this measure of institutional trust, which is a measure that's ostensibly a measure of people's faith in public institutions. Concretely, what it is, it's just the census form mail-in rate and the voting rate in a place, or the voting registration rate, I forget. But it varies a lot across places. It turns out to be correlated with things. So you can sort of think of it as a measure of sort of how much do people, and the reason it's useful to think about conceptually is in places where people trusted in public institutions are much more likely to trust public health officials or to follow advice or to adhere to requirements about closure or masking or something like that, that it's a potential kind of resource or capital. And then the other thing that's highly correlated with this is the percent of white or Asian students in a district. Those four things hang together really well. They have, like, the factor has an eigenvalue of 5 point something. It's, so that's one index. It's just sort of a general social economic resource kind of index. Yes?
Does less voting mean more trust?
More voting means more trust, I believe. Yeah, more, I'm trying to think if it's voting or voter registration. But whatever it is, more is correlated with higher census mailback rates and positively correlated with these other things. Then we have a measure of, you can think of as a sort of a lousy measure of school resources. It's just the staff to student ratio in a school district, which varies a lot across places, and sort of is a measure of how many adult staff are there in a school district who might have been able to help kids out in different ways during the pandemic, whether that's tutoring or providing meals or any of the other kinds of services that districts were trying to do in addition to online teaching. Then there's a social capital index, which is from the Chetty Opportunity Index. It's based on Facebook data, and it's a measure of how connected people are and how many friends they have in common. It's a kind of a social connectedness measure. And even though it seems like a kind of capital or resource, it's not correlated with these things very highly, so we don't include it in that index. And nor is this one very correlated with this. So even though these are kind of resources, they don't sort of load very well into that index, so we keep them separately. We also have a measure of kind of pandemic disruptions to everyday life. So this has a whole bunch of things in it that are highly correlated. So one is the percent of school year that instruction was remote during the 2020-21 school year. This is Nat Malkus at AEI provided these data. And we have a measure of like how much stores were closed, restaurants were closed, how much in-person socializing or contact people had, how much people took precautions like wearing a mask. And these data come partly from SafeGraph data, where you can measure kind of where people went and were there lots of people going to restaurants or not. And a survey done by Facebook. So Facebook during the pandemic, starting in maybe March or April or something of 2020, they fielded a survey in conjunction with Carnegie Mellon that had something like 50,000 respondents a day. And they continued that for over 2 years. And so we have monthly data at the county level of a whole bunch of questions like, did you go to a restaurant, or do you wear a mask, or are you anxious about COVID and things like this. And they're very big samples, even at the county level, and so we aggregate those data over the 2-year period to get sort of local measures of some of these things. So that goes into this as well. Then we have a joblessness rate. This is just not, it's not the unemployment rate, it's the percentage of people who weren't working in a county, in a school district during the pandemic. We have a remote job posting rate. This is data from one of my colleagues at Stanford they scraped job advertisements to look for how many jobs people were looking for remote jobs in each county in the United States over the pandemic. And then all those things are super highly correlated with the percent of vote share for Republicans in 2020 or 2016. I think it's 2016 vote share. So this index is sort of a measure of how much places were sort of shut down and life was disrupted. Life as we know it was radically different if you're high on this index. And it was sort of business as usual if you're low on this index. And all of these things load positively with this, and this loads negatively with this. So Republican places have low disruption index, and Democratic places tend to have high ones. Yeah.
So, Sean, on the ACS, there is something that is analogous to the remote job thing, and it's sort of hidden on there because it asks, how long was your commute to work last week? And one of the options is
work at home.
I worked at home. So anyway, it would be a way to measure that correctly.
That's great. All right, we will add that. The other two things we have here are the COVID death rate per 100,000 aggregated over the span of the pandemic to get a kind of average death rate in a these are county level death rates. And then the Facebook survey also included some measures of, they were surveying adults, and they're measures of anxiety and depression and things like that. So it's a pretty crude proxy for kind of adults' levels of stress, anxiety, and depression. So those are the main covariates we have in the model. We have some controls like suburban, urban, rural, district size, and so on. But the sort of ones of interest are these. We'd love to have some other ones, but this is what we've got so far. So let me show you some results. So first I'll just show you some sort of bivariate relationships. So these are all going to look like this. This is a district characteristics. They're all standardized, mean 0, standard deviation 1. And then this is here I'm going to show you the predicted counterfactual change in the gender gap. This is what the gender gap would have looked like in those districts had the prior trend continued to 2022. And so in this case, in sort of low resource places, boys and girls would have been at about parity. And in high resource places, boys would have been outperforming girls by roughly 0.05 standard deviations. That's our predicted counterfactual.
Is that predicted change or predicted gender gap?
It's the predicted change in the gender gap.
Oh, so you're saying low resource places, there would be no change in the gender gap over the...
Yes, sorry, I said levels, but this has changed, yes. So the prediction would have been no change in the gender gap in low resource places and a decline, a boy favoring shift in high resource places. In other research we've done before, the pattern generally is in math. Gender gaps favor boys in high SES places, and they favor girls or are sort of at parity in low SES places. So prior to the pandemic, that's the pattern, that gaps are more boy favoring in math in affluent places and less so or reversed in poor places. The reading gaps prior to the pandemic, sort of no association with community SES. They're pretty much the same everywhere and quite girl favoring. So what we would have predicted is the same thing would have continued even more so, right?
What grade is this?
This is averaged over 3rd through 8th grade. So we would have predicted that the gaps would have become even more boy favoring as time went on in the rich places and stayed about the same in the poor places. And then this is what we actually see. This is the observed change. So if you just take the straight drop. So this isn't the parameter of the difference, this is just the straight drop. So the place where the gaps really went boy favoring was in the low resource places. And some decline, but much less so in the affluent places. And if you take the difference between those, that's our parameter, right? It's the difference between the observed and the predicted. And you can see that in affluent places, on average, there's no change in the gender gap. And it's all in this story driven by the change in the gender gap in low resource places. That girls fell further behind boys during the pandemic, but that's driven entirely by what happened in low resource communities. So I'll show you a few of these for the other main covariates, but I'm just going to show you this slide, not the first two. First I'll show you, I went back and forth, like, how do you show a four-way interaction? So, I tried a few different ways. That's one. This is the same exact data, but shown differently. Now we're looking at the trends in the gender gap in high and low SES places. And so you can see in the low SES places, we would have predicted, no change in the gap, but in fact it went boy favoring by a lot. And in the high SES places, we would have predicted, a sizable decline, but it didn't go down that much. So that's the same data I just showed you. In reading, there's not as much of a difference between high and low SES places, and the difference isn't so much, but there's a pronounced pattern in math. Okay, so now this is the COVID disruption index. And you can see the pandemic effect, that is the change in the unexpected change in the gap, I guess is the way to say it, is pretty constant regardless of it. So it doesn't seem like the decline in the gender gap is driven by girls sort of faring differently well when COVID was really disrupting life versus when it was not. And this is the other way of looking at it, but same data. This is the school staff. So in places where there was a lot of school staff per pupil, gender gaps didn't really change, but in places where there was few school staff. And this school staff variable is not very correlated with the resource variable, so this is not entirely duplicative information. So again, the girls fared worse in places with fewer resources, in this case, educational resources. This is the COVID death rate in the community. In places where the death rate was very low, gaps didn't decline very much or shift towards boys, but they shifted more so towards boys moderately, not enormously, but in higher death rate places. So it does seem to be some relationship between the death rate and the change in the gap. And then finally, the social capital measure. So places with high social capital, no change from predicted in the gap, but places with low social capital, the gap widened in favor of boys. So there's this sort of pattern here where girls fared worse in places with low resources, whether those are economic resources, educational resources, social resources, and whatnot. And in places that were high on those kind of resource measures, the gap didn't widen at all in general. So it seems like that pattern, from a descriptive point of view, the pattern we see of gender gaps widening in favor of boys, I've showed you math here. It's not super different in reading. Seems driven by low resource communities, by what happened to girls in low resource communities. That's the picture again. So these are just the coefficients from those bivariate models I just showed you. And then here's a model where we put them all in together along with some controls. And even when they're all in there together, the girls still fare better in high resource places, no disruption association. They fare better in places with lots of school staff, worse in places with a high death rate, and better in places with high social capital. I got to tell you, like, a p-value of 0.001 on a four-way interaction in a multivariate model, I don't know. Like, that seems sort of surprising to me, but there it is. So those seem like fairly robust patterns. This is the reading one. Again, positive association, like girls fare better in high resource places. They fare worse in more disrupted places. They fare better in places with more school staff. There's no association with death rates. And they fare better in places with high social capital. So relatively consistent across the two subjects, though the death rate and disruption coefficients sort of go in and out of significance depending on whether you're looking at math and reading. Was there a question back there? Eric?
So can you go back to the math one?
Yeah.
You were sort of summarizing the takeaway as something about resources, low resource community. But it's striking to me that, like, you know, the coefficient on SES resources falls by half. The school staff coefficient does not fall by half.
And social capital doesn't fall at all.
Right. What's that?
Social capital doesn't change at all.
Right. And if, like, we take seriously the low correlation between SES resources and school staff, that means that there are communities that are very wealthy but have chosen to have fewer adults work in their schools. And there are communities that are not very wealthy but have chosen to have more adults work in their schools to spend more of their sort of marginal tax dollars. Like, so is this like a resources in the traditional way, or is this something about the community's investment in kids in particular? Like, are there other measures of school that you could get besides school staff, like other community organizations? Or?
Yeah, the community organizations is part of the social capital index. There's some measures in there of the number of people who belong to volunteer organizations and number of nonprofit organizations in a community. So there's some of that is in this social capital index. The school staff coefficient may be a sort of a state level effect in the sense of states with lots of resources also tend to be places that weren't shut down and things like that. And so when we put in state fixed effects, which I didn't show you here because those models are, I think there's a mistake with how we did them. I didn't want to confuse everything right now, but that coefficient seems to go away when we put in state fixed effects. So it may be that it's in states with lots of school resources that is sort of driving that association. So yeah, what I want to do is take this model and predict for each community what we would predict its change in the gap would be, given all the information, and then sort of look at that and figure out, like, where are the kinds of places that were predicted to have big changes or small changes, because it's a little hard to kind of, this is why I hate regression. It's sort of a little hard to know entirely what to make. This, like I was saying to someone earlier, like regression is in the unhappy valley between good descriptive research and good causal research. It's sort of neither. Like these are partial correlations. I don't even know how to make sense of that really. So like I only put that model in there to sort of show these things aren't duplicative in the sense that these aren't just the same story being told over and over again. There is some sort of independent association, but I don't know what to make of the magnitude of them and things like that.
I guess, like, set aside the regression. Is this a story about, like, a community's sort of monetary wealth, or about how they choose to allocate their...
Maybe both. I mean, this has like monetary wealth in it. This might be allocation decisions at the state or at the local level. This is something different. I mean, sociologists think of different kinds of capital, economic capital, social capital, structural forms of capital, and so on. So you could sort of think of these as kind of crudely mapping onto kind of different kinds of capital. And I think if, to the extent this is chosen by states or districts, then, it's endogenous, but everything here is endogenous. It's trying to think of, if you're a kid growing up in a place like this, what happens to you, regardless of who chose for the place to be like that? That's the way I think of it. I got one over here, and then Tom. Luke?
I'm super interested in the state fixed effects version, because without state fixed effects, if I'm following, it seems like there are two issues. One is things like school staff and things like that could be a proxy for states if the states are systematically different there. And the other thing is the way that you built the data set is linked through NAEP. And NAEP is realigning the states with each other, which means that you have this error structure that's shared across states, which means that all your p-values here are assuming that you got the NAEP linkage exactly right. Like you're not propagating that uncertainty. Right?
Yeah. To the extent these are gaps, the NAEP uncertainty is not there because it's subtracted out, like you're subtracting two scores that have the same error in them. But because we residualize the gaps using NAEP, and we put some NAEP error back into it, so there is a kind of a shared state level error here that's not accounted for in this. The other thought, though, that makes me wonder about state fixed effects models is, like, this presumes that the things that influence a kid are all entirely local and not there's no sort of spillover. Like if my state is sending out messages saying, you might die, stay at home, wear your mask, everything's horrible, which it seemed like to me at times, but that might affect me even if my community chooses not to follow those rules very much, and vice versa. That is sort of taking out any of the state factor may take away some of the mechanism that drives this if we think there's some kind of broader contextual thing that shapes it. And so it's a little bit hard to know whether we're taking away some part of the thing we want to describe or whether we're taking away some error that's getting in the way of us describing it.
You could, between all of your covariates and then get both. You can just directly estimate the contextual effect of state with a model on state.
Yeah. Yeah, we need a 4-level hierarchical model to do that, and I have to fiddle with the software to make it do it. So we haven't done that yet. But yeah, we could sort of like try to. We don't have much power to do the between state thing, but we could still look at it. Tom, or you? You didn't ask anything yet. Tom already talked.
Okay. I guess I'm curious about, like, have you put these into context to see, like, whether or not, like, the findings over here, like, on the national level, like, also works if you look, like, if you zoom in on, say, like, state level data? Because I'm thinking in terms of, like, the spillovers you mentioned, and also like just specific states might have, like, although if we quantify things, like even if districts say like have this similar SES score, but then like there's a lot of factors under SES that is like affecting the scores, and so like maybe these districts that have the same score actually differentiate a little. And so, like, I'm just curious about whether or not, like, you or your team have looked into, like, the more granular part of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a data limitation because we don't know a lot more detail about districts on many of these dimensions. We have taken some of these, like the SES factor has 4 things in it, and we've run the models separately for them. And so the patterns are pretty similar if you look at socioeconomic status, if you look at broadband access, and if you look at institutional trust, they all have the same sort of sign, at least the same direction of the sign and significance. That's part of what we use to make, when we put things together, to make sure we weren't, like, the death rate is somewhat correlated with disruption, but it's negatively correlated with disruption. And so, but the signs on them are in the same direction. And so when you put it in there, it kind of fights against itself. So we sort of break it up to try to do that. So it's kind of a battle between kind of trying to be parsimonious and trying to not smush everything in the model together and lose any signal.
So, Sean, I can't remember on the CCD how they break up the school staff and the different types of roles, but
We could disaggregate it, yeah.
But also when I started to think about that, which came from my
Thanks, Tom.
my companion, Christina, it occurred to me that in the census, you would know social workers per capita, psychiatrists per capita, like there might be some occupational data that you wouldn't trust the within community changes over time, but even if you just, got a good estimate over average the ACS over a few years,
Yeah.
might help you say, okay, was it, I just know as a parent of a high school student during the pandemic, it was really hard to find psychologists who worked with high school age kids.
Right.
Even here in Massachusetts, and I'm sure like in lots of other communities, it was way worse.
Yeah, so what I hear, and I think it's good, is to sort of try to be more fine-grained about both the kinds of staff available and maybe also the kinds of professions in the community that might be thought of as resources for kids. We can certainly look into that.
I think just joining in on that bandwagon, one thing that I'm curious about is whether or not there's like pedagogical changes occurring in these districts. So I was going to ask, instead of using the index for disruption, have you tried just running it with percent of days not in school as sort of a proxy?
Yeah. It turns out that's not statistically related to it. It's not driven, this disruption thing is not driven by school closures. It seems to be more driven by out-of-school kinds of disruptions. So when we put in school closure rate or rate of not in-person instruction in there, that's not in a bivariate model associated with it. It loads pretty heavily into this disruption index, so we put it in there, but it's not, if you break it up, it's not the thing that's driving that train. It's more this, I don't want to go all the way back there. The index that sort of says things like restaurants and store closures and how much socializing did people do and how worried were you about COVID and things like that. That's the one that loads most heavily and is most strongly associated with this. So, what I think that says is that the story for why girls fared worse during the pandemic than boys is not look like it's a story about schooling and that the change in modality was particularly bad for girls than boys. It seems to be more related to the sort of out-of-school things that happen. And, Tom, we found this in our paper. Generally, if you looked at where did test scores decline the most, it wasn't very related. It was modestly related to school closures, but it was much more related to other sort of out-of-school things. And so, partly the fixation of folks on school closures as the sort of the bugaboo for what made everything terrible during the pandemic for kids, I think is a little misguided. Imagine that you're 10 and you can't see your friends and you have to wear a mask and you're told the world is dangerous and you might die or your parents might die or your grandmother's sick and she might die, but you can't go to the hospital and see her and who knows when it will end. Who cares whether you're in school or not? Like, you're freaked out, I think, and it seems like that would be a very distressing force in a kid's life.
For girls, they might also just have more responsibilities.
Yeah.
So if you are 10, but you have 4 siblings, everyone's home, your brothers might be able to, but you will probably have to make people lunch. I wonder about the role that girls had to play during the disruption in the home, particularly in homes that had lower resources than other, particularly if those parents left them at home alone while they still, because they were essential workers.
Right. Yeah, so that's one of the hypotheses I said at the beginning, was this sort of different gender roles and responsibilities. And we don't have any direct way of assessing it because we can't tell how many siblings kids we're caring for or not. But
if the gap interacts with grade, because you'd expect that to be a larger force for older girls.
yeah, when we interact these things with grade, we generally find null associations. Or in a few cases, we find the effects are stronger for young kids. But there's so many coefficients that I sort of don't think it's, but there's no pattern of evidence suggesting that these things are stronger for older kids. It's all sort of null or a little bit stronger for young kids, if anything. I'm going to do the last 2 or 3 slides, and then we'll have a little more time. All right, look, conclusions. I probably already said all this, but the one thing that I think is important is that before the pandemic, girls did better relative to boys in low resource communities, and boys did better in high resource communities. And so it's a little bit puzzling that whatever was good about high resource communities for boys and good about low resource communities for girls pre-pandemic, it didn't get exaggerated during the pandemic or continue in the same way. It got reversed. And so I don't have a clear story other than sort of some version of, Christina, what you said, which is, in places with low resources, girls got asked to do more, expected to do more, and maybe also were sort of more affected by the pandemic in general. But I think it's useful to keep in mind this is not what was happening before the pandemic. This is a reversal. And then the second sort of general pattern is that the pandemic had more of a negative effect on girls in places most impacted by the pandemic, either places that were sort of shut down the most or places where death rates are higher. These patterns are a little bit less consistent across math and reading than the sort of resource ones are, but generally in this sort of direction. And then as I said, the school closure rates doesn't seem to be what drives this. It seems to be more like the general shutdownness. And so, I think the kind of candidates for explanations for these patterns are that that the impact of girls is driven, that this stuff is driven by kind of social isolation, more caregiving, more anxiety and depression, and maybe a reversion to traditional gender roles. There is this evidence, as I said in the beginning, that adults espoused more traditional gender roles during the pandemic than they had before. And there's some international research showing that in times of crises, girls fare the worst. So in developing countries, when there's a drought or something, it's that girls fare the worst, partly because they're expected to do a lot more work and caregiving, and partly, I think, because they're not prioritized in terms of resource allocation. And whether that's a general pattern that holds in a developed country like the US during the pandemic, I don't know, but there certainly is this evidence of kind of a reversion to a kind of more traditional gender norms. I'm not sure that's only pandemic related. It's that pattern seems to have persisted post-pandemic. I think the kind of gender rhetoric and what's acceptable to say about gender in public these days is, I think, vastly different than it was 5 or 8 years ago. And so I don't know whether that reversion to more traditional gender roles that was sort of measured during the pandemic is just maybe part of a kind of more of a secular trend that's maybe not particularly pandemic related or not, I don't know. So that's what I got. Thank you, guys. We have a few more minutes for questions, I think, if you have more.
Sean, thank you. It's really interesting. Question is, are these lasting scars for for these young people who lost out, particularly in low communities with temporary setbacks. And I wondered, have you or others used, for example, National Student Clearinghouse data to look at whether there are, whether you see these impacts on college enrollment or college perseverance?
We have not looked at sort of anything post 8th grade. Most of this analysis and our other work has been sort of 3rd through 8th grade. I think, you know, it's getting to the point where enough cohorts have sort of passed graduation age from high school that we might be able to sort of see whether some of these patterns persist. One thing I think, a minor point, but that's sort of relevant, is, let's see. You see this pattern happens a lot. There's a big negative impact, and then a bounce back that suggests that, you know, this was something COVID specific, and so while lots of people are dying around you, you're anxious and stressed and fearful and you don't focus on school. But once that happens, you sort of can go back to focusing on school. That's sort of one story about it. In contrast to that, though, the correlation between this COVID drop parameter, you know, the beta 3, and the post-COVID slope is really high. So even though there's on average an upswing, the places that fell the most had the smallest bounce back, and the places that fell the least had the biggest bounce back. So it's not quite like you would expect if it's just a sort of temporary effect. In places where the effect was big, it seems like it was lasting, and in places where it's small, it wasn't lasting, is more the story. We haven't explored this a whole lot. I want to sort of think about more like looking at what happens post-pandemic to this sort of bounce back question. That's a roundabout way, Dick, of saying, I don't know if these really persist or not. And, you know, hopefully other people will look at the post-high school stuff, and we'll be looking further at these cohorts of kids as well. Any other questions? Andrew?
You showed some bubble plots, but didn't call out any bubbles. I don't want to add another difference to your pile of differences, but do you have any thoughts about whether any of those bubbles is illustrative of something systematic?
I have not waded into the bubble bath yet to sort of figure that out. These are empirical Bayes estimates because the individual estimates, particularly for small places, are pretty unreliable. Like, even though we have a lot of data, like to estimate that parameter well for one place, especially a smallish place, it's not super reliable. The big places are much more reliable, so you might look at some of the big places. But I wouldn't want to sort of call out this place and say, oh, it's really an outlier when, you know, in my OL estimate of it was way up here and I just shrank it down a whole bunch because I didn't really trust it, then that means I still don't trust it when it's here. So I think we could look at some of the big places and see if we could learn something more from them, but I wouldn't trust the point estimates for the small places.
So I noticed that in one of your slides, you mentioned that you look at the percentage of white and Asian households. Is that like, do you look at them together? Are you grouping these together?
We're basically saying what proportion is Black, Hispanic, and Native American versus what proportion is white, Hispanic.
What is the reasoning behind that? I might want to challenge you on this.
Challenge away. The reason is mostly that they're highly correlated, and so breaking it down sort of finer doesn't give us a lot more information.
Kind of, you think that like it's more correlated in terms of their academic performance? Is that what you're saying?
It's more that the compositions are more correlated, like, yeah. Now, certainly, like if you went to St. Paul, I don't know, 30% of the kids are Asian and they're really poor, you know, mostly Southeast Asian refugees, and they don't look like the kind of middle-class Chinese families in San Francisco or something. Like, so not to say that Asian is in any way a kind of monolithic category, but statistically, the sort of useful split in the demographic data, the one that's sort of most predictive is the Black, Hispanic, Native, white Asian one. It'd certainly be possible to dig in more.